how do you analyze the impact of globalization on education and employment? At first, clarification. The term globalization is very seriously misused in contemporary ideology. Globalization just means international integration. That's a fine thing. Everyone is in favor of globalization. So I'm in favor of the fact that I'm able to appear here and to listen to you and to talk to you and to do it by other forms of communication, to interchange ideas and goods and so on. That's all fine. That's globalization. The term now is used in a very special way. It's used to refer to a specific form of international economic integration that has been imposed in the past 25 years by a small sector of wealth and power, the few rich states, the international financial institutions that they control, and the international corporate sector to which in effect they represent. And they have defined a specific form of international integration, which is to the benefit of investors and lenders and speculators and financial institutions, in which the place of the population of the world is more or less incidental. They may be harmed, they may be helped, it doesn't matter. That's what's called globalization. The power of dominant Western institutions is so enormous that their notion of globalization has become the common term. But I think those of us who oppose that, as most people in the world do, are making a serious mistake if they are willing to accept this rhetorical framework and are willing to be characterized as anti-globalization. No sane person is anti-globalization. The question is whether you're in favor of this particular form of investor rights, corporate rights, international integration, and most of the population of the world is not. So when we talk about globalization, we should be careful to make clear that we're referring to a specific doctrinal construction related to concentrated power. It's not. Especially the left, its entire history is based on international solidarity. The highest level of working people, ordinary populations, that's always been the highest goal of the left from its modern origins, and that's the supreme form of globalization, which is in favor of. Question: what is the impact of corporate-led investor rights globalization on education and employment? Well, harmful. Just as it's harmful in most aspects of life. In fact, the current form of globalization has even harmed the economy. Contrary to much propaganda that you hear, the world economy has declined significantly. Its rate of growth has declined significantly in the last 25 years, precisely in the areas, in the regions that have accepted most religiously the doctrines of the faith of corporate-led globalization. That's true of the rich countries, like the United States, for example. The rate of growth of the economy, of productivity, wages, and so on, has slowed considerably in the past 25 years. And for most of the population, it's been an extremely poor period in terms of income, working hours, security, and so on. Part of and the same is true almost everywhere else, there has been enormous concentration of wealth and power in very small sectors. That has happened, but the general economic progress has slowed considerably under globalization. In fact, rather surprisingly, even trade, the rate of growth of trade has slowed down in the past 25 years. It was faster in the first 25 years after the Second World War than it's been in the past 25 years, globalization period. So in general, it's a pretty gloomy period, the so-called globalization period, for most of the world, except for small sectors of wealth and power. power as the main theme of neoliberalism. And of course, it has harmed education and employment, as you would expect. It's taken resources, both it's taken resources away from education, and it's taken decisions away from the public with regard to education, and transferred them more and more into private hands, unaccountable private hands. And that will continue. I mean, elite education will probably prosper, but general education undoubtedly will decline in this system. As historic event, one which will change history, is this change simply because the guns were turned against the United States? How do you think history is going to change? What's the likely course it will take? Has the course of history already changed, at least for the time being, since the collapse of the Second World by the end of the 1980s? A lot of questions. Yeah, there's been subjected to much worse atrocities for a long, long time. One minor example, which is relevant because it's so similar to this one. The United States is now destroying Afghanistan because Afghanistan, the Taliban, refused to turn over a particular person unless the United States gives some evidence of his guilt. The United States refused for some of the left, the U.S. refused to give any evidence, therefore they don't turn him over, and therefore the U.S. is destroying the country. They accuse him of being, without any evidence, of being responsible for the death of maybe 5,000 people. Well, right now in the United States, there is a leader of a Haitian paramilitary group in Haiti, which was backed by the United States, which killed about 5,000 people a few years ago under a military equipment that the United States supported. He's been, there's no problem in his case about finding the evidence. There's no doubt that he's guilty. He's primarily responsible for the killing of about 5,000 poor black people in Haiti a few years ago with U.S. support. Haiti has been trying to expedite. They want the United States to turn him over to Haiti. Of course, the United States refuses. He's been tried in Haiti and sentenced, but they want him to return so he can face justice. And the U.S. refuses. In fact, the case is so minor that it's not even reported in the United States. A few weeks ago, Haiti once again asked for him to be extradited, and again, there's plenty of evidence. It wasn't even reported. Well, it's a very similar case, except that Haiti has a much stronger case. They have the evidence. They presented it. They put him on trial. The U.S. does not want to release him because if he does appear, he'll probably tell unpleasant things about the relation of the paramilitary forces that were carrying out the massacres with U.S. intelligence during the period of the military rule. This is not considered an issue. That's the way things are supposed to be. The United States and Europe are supposed to attack and destroy others, but they're not supposed to be attacked themselves. So yes, this is a historic event. It's the first time in history of the United States, and in fact, the first time in the entire history of Europe that the guns have been pointed in the other direction. So that's a dramatic change. The major theme in history of the last several centuries is Europe's conquest of the world. Europe and its North American offshoots conquered the world in an extremely brutal fashion, massive extermination, disasters. I don't have to tell you about the fate of India. And Europe has been immune to retaliation. It's the first time it's not immune. And you can understand easily the shock in Europe over this fact. We're supposed to do this kind of thing to other people. We're not supposed to do it to us. That's a change, first change in hundreds of years. How is history going to change? I don't think it will change very much. There will be an effort to reconstitute the same assault against the world conducted by narrow power centers, which happen to be largely localized in Europe, and I presume that will continue until the population of the world is capable of resisting it and overthrowing the forms of power that carries out. Has the course of history been changed since the collapse of the Second World at the end of the 1980s? Not very much, actually. Here I think we have to decode a lot of mythology when they carried out an atrocity in their domain, it was in defense against the other superpower. It was never true, but it was a pretext that sort of worked to mobilize the population. Well, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that pretense doesn't work anymore. So new pretenses are needed, but the policies remain the same. If you look at what happened after the fall of the Berlin Wall in the United States, the policies remain almost identical, except that the pretext changed. So, and that was recognized. So immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the first thing the United States did about a month later was invade Panama. They invaded Panama, they killed several dozen people, they destroyed workers' housing, they vetoed 2 Security Council resolutions condemning it, because they wanted to kidnap somebody who in fact had been a CIA operative for years and had committed many crimes as a CIA operative, but then had become reluctant to do his job, so he had to be punished. That was the invasion of Panama. Well, you know, that's so routine that it's like a small footnote in history. That's what goes on all the time. That it was recognized right away that this had to be different. Had to be different, and the justifications had to be different. So it wasn't because the Russians are coming and we have to defend ourselves. It was because we have to protect ourselves from narco traffickers or terrorists or some other excuse. The actions are the same, the pretext is different. And in fact, this is true down to close detail. So military planning was modified. We have an official record of that. The Pentagon shifted its programs from what was called a target, a weapons-rich area. Russia was called a weapons-rich area. That's plenty of weapons. And much of the strategic military planning was aimed at Russia. Well, no point doing that anymore. So planning was shifted to what is called a target-rich area. The former Third World is a target-rich area, lots of targets to hit with weapons of mass destruction. And that led to some change in military planning. So small nuclear weapons, other kinds of technology, space-based weapons, aimed at controlling the Third World. The policies remain the same. The tactics changed and the pretext changed. And it was often conceded quite publicly. So immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when the former President Bush asked for, sent his annual message to Congress calling for a huge military budget, it turned out it was exactly the same as every preceding year except for the pretext. The preceding years we needed a huge military budget in order to defend ourselves against the Russians. In March 1990, right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we needed a huge military budget to defend ourselves against, and I'm quoting now, the technological sophistication of the Third World. That's why we needed a huge military budget. It was a kind of a shift towards honesty. All up until that time, there was pretense that the attacks against the Third World were defense against the Russians. Now let's crank it over. It's not defense against the Russians. It's defense against the Third World. And this is expected to continue. Globalization is going to lead to an increased divide between a small sector of rich and a large sector of poor, internal to the countries and among countries. And they expect that there will be turbulence and unrest among the growing sectors of people who are harmed by the process of corporate-led globalization, and therefore new military systems are needed to control them. That's the primary reason why the United States, in fact quite open, it's not a secret, you read it in the internal documents, that's the primary reason why the United States is trying to move towards militarization of space, use of space for offensive military actions, which they describe quite frankly as just the next frontier. In the past, countries used armies and navies to protect their commercial interests and investment. They used the Air Force. Now we're going to have to use space, which the U.S. more or less monopolizes, to protect U.S. Commercial interests and investments and access to resources. throughout the world and to control the growing numbers of unruly people around the world. That's official policy. Essentially in those words, if you're interested, you can read it in the high-level documents. So there's a change, and the existence of the Soviet Union imposed a certain restraint on the use of violence. Similarly, the Soviet Union was restricted in the use of violence because of the United States. So during the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, for example, they didn't destroy cities. They didn't wipe out, Kandahar, because there was a constraint. The U.S. was a constraining force, and in fact had set up a huge mercenary army there, including primarily radical Islamists, to limit the Soviet Union. The U.S. faces no such constraints anymore, can freely do whatever it likes. And we've seen that immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So when Britain and the United States sent 500,000 men to attack Iraq in 1990, that's something they never would have done if the Soviet Union was still there, because it would have been too dangerous. Now it's not dangerous anymore. So you can attack anyone you like, destroy anyone you like, use any force you like, there are no limits. And for the third world, that's a disaster, and it's recognized to be. It's recognized by the most anti-communist leaders. So Prime Minister Mahathir of Malaysia is strongly anti-communist, but he's described the fall of the Soviet Union as a disaster, precisely because it allows the imperial powers, the United States, Britain, and allies, to do anything they want without constraint. So yes, there are changes, but they're not changes in policy. They're changes in tactics and in ideology. Whatever the West or the U.S. may do to deny it isn't the new war against terror propelled by the ideology of the clash of civilizations. Here I agree with the U.S. government. It has nothing to do with any clash of civilizations. That's propaganda. After the fall of the Soviet Union, it was necessary to invent new pretexts for carrying out the same policies. And one of the pretexts that was invented, in this case in the academic world, was clash of civilizations. So before this, we were fighting communism. Now we're fighting other civilizations, Islam or Confucianism or whatever. And it's total nonsense. I mean, you simply look at the alignments in the world and you'll see that it's complete nonsense. For example, the most fundamentalist Islamic state in the world is Saudi Arabia. It's been a U.S. client since its origins, remains so. The biggest Muslim state in the world is Indonesia, by far. Again, it's been a U.S. favorite ever since the Indonesian generals in 1965 carried out a huge massacre, killed maybe 1 million people, mostly landless peasants, and destroyed the only mass-based political party in the country, the Communist Party, which was the party of the poor. After they achieved that, they became a U.S. favorite. That's the biggest Islamic state in the world. In the 1980s, who did the CIA organize to fight against the Russians? The most extreme radical Islamicists they could find anywhere in North Africa and Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. They were the ones who were organized to be a mercenary army to fight the Russians. So, they're not only the allies, they're the creation of the United States, including Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Meanwhile, in the same years, the United States was fighting a war against the Catholic Church. The U.S. war in Central America, which was a violent, murderous war, left hundreds of thousands of people killed, 4 countries in total ruins. A large part of it was fought against the Catholic Church. The 1980s began with the assassination of an archbishop. The decade ended with the assassination of 6 leading Jesuit intellectuals, all by the military and paramilitary forces trained and organized and controlled by the United States. And that was what was happening right through the period. I mean, there were also, tens of thousands of peasants and indigenous people and so on who got killed. That's usual. Slaughtered, not just killed. Why was the U.S. fighting the Catholic Church? Well, the Latin American church since the 1960s had changed. For hundreds of years, it had been the church of the rich. But in the 1960s, it shifted and undertook what was called the preferential option for the poor. It would begin to work for the poor. And they did. So priests and nuns were organizing peasant collectives and study groups and helping people try to struggle against injustice and for human rights, and therefore they had to be slaughtered. It happened that they were Catholics, but that didn't matter. In fact, if you just look at the most elementary facts of contemporary history, you can see that the talk of clash of civilization is nonsense. It's a clash of the rich and the powerful against anyone who happens to stand up for their rights and for their freedom and independence against the onslaught of the powerful. They can be black, white, green, Muslims, Catholics, whatever they are. It doesn't make any difference. If they make that wrong decision, they have to be destroyed. There's no clash of civilizations any more than there was before. Comment on the nature of the anti-war sentiment in the U.S. and the West. What about the left? The Marxist response to the September 11th and so on. Would I bracket them with Christopher Hitchens' response, which is like the clash of civilizations? First of all, remember that in the United States and in Western Europe there is no Marxist response. There's no Marxist movement. So the left is something different. It doesn't have a Marxist orientation except for small sects. But there's a very powerful left and a very powerful anti-war sentiment. Most of the population by now is strongly opposed to U.S. aggression and violence. It's a big change from 40 years ago. You saw that in the 1980s. Remember, the war on terrorism is not new. The Reagan administration called it 20 years ago. And proceeded to organize massive international terrorism on an unprecedented scale, primarily against Central America, but also in Africa and West Asia and elsewhere. However, they were unable to do what John F. Kennedy had done 20 years earlier. He was just able to send the U.S. military forces to invade South Vietnam and to attack the rest of the country. Reagan couldn't do that. He could not send the U.S. military to bomb, to occupy Nicaragua. He couldn't send B-52s to bomb El Salvador. That was ruled out. And it was ruled out by public opposition to direct aggression and violence, which is very strong. Therefore, the Reagan administration had to resort to clandestine terrorism, huge terrorist network, including client states like Britain and Taiwan and Israel and Saudi Arabia and others, to support paramilitary forces and client military forces to try to crush the population. Huge international terrorism. But that's because of the anti-war sentiment, and that remains. Right now, there's a sense of, naturally, of shock and fear and despair over the atrocities, which is quite right, but the population is not in favor of war. When you read the headlines, it may look like that, but if you look more closely, it's a very mixed, confused situation. I know I myself have even been on national television in interchange programs with mass audiences, something which never happened before, and they're quite the questions that come in the discussions are reasonable. People want punishment for the ones who carried out the atrocities, but they don't want to kill innocent people. That's why the huge humanitarian catastrophe in Afghanistan is not being reported. You watch CNN or BBC or read the newspapers, you read very little about the fact that hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people are facing imminent starvation and death as a result of the U.S. response to the September 11th atrocities. That's what ought to be the headlines. I mean, that's a major crime, but it's barely mentioned. And the reason it's barely mentioned is because of an understanding that if the population knows anything about it, they won't permit it, and therefore it has to be suppressed, and it is suppressed. Christopher Hitchens is a different story. He's can talk about that, but he's a particular individual who happens to have gone completely berserk on this issue. That doesn't mean much, and it's not interesting. You, the American, really agree with the U.S. policies of supporting authority. Do I
I'm not sure I understand this. Do I agree with the U.S. policies of supporting authoritarian and brutal regimes in order to protect U.S. economic and military interests? No, certainly not. We should oppose such efforts with all of our strength. They have a horrible effect on the world and are extremely dangerous. The public has to be excluded from the process of decision-making, manufacturing consent, and so on. It was reported that the Doha agenda was passed by Europe and the United States using the war situation. People weren't informed of the hidden agenda. Lots of questions like that. Yeah, that's true. I mean, it is understood, particularly in the more democratic societies. Strikingly, first in the United States and Britain, and extending to other more democratic societies. It was understood, 100 years ago, with the growth of parliamentary labor parties and labor unions and extensions of the franchise and restrictions on the use of force by the state. It was understood that people are not, it's going to become increasingly difficult to control people by violence. And therefore it's necessary to control them by propaganda. That's explicitly understood. That's why the United States and Britain have huge public relations industries, which are devoted to propaganda, to what they call regimenting the public mind. And the purpose is very explicit. Make sure that the population does not get involved in what's none of their business, namely public affairs. They're supposed to be occupied with something else, buying shoes or watching sports or something or other, but not getting involved in controlling their own lives, whether in the workplace or in the political arena or anywhere else. That's the goal of what's called manufacturing consent. Not my term. The term that was used by the leading figure in 20th century media and the leading public intellectual in the United States in the 20th century, Walter Lippmann. Very explicit. We have to manufacture consent to ensure that the public remains spectators, not participants in affairs that deal with their lives. The neoliberal programs of the past 20 years are simply another device to try to undermine democracy and remove the public and to manufacture consent, in this case not by direct violence, but by the fear of insecurity and so on. As far as Doha is concerned, the U.S. and Europe have their own agendas, which are incidentally not exactly identical. They have some conflicts, and they would like to ram them through. But it doesn't have to happen. The end result of the Doha conference was to delay the issues. They didn't really reach any specific decisions. They delayed them to secret negotiations, in which people won't be able to see anything about what's happening. What goes on in those secret negotiations is the responsibility to determine. That's the responsibility of people like you and me. We have to compel our governments to act in ways that are humane and decent, or simply to withdraw from the whole system. That's in public hands. These things are carried out in secret precisely because they're afraid of the public. And they make it very clear. The public is an enemy, which has to be controlled by silence and ignorance. And if the public discovers what's happening, they rise up and protest. It's happened again and again, increasingly in the last few years. So it's not really a hidden agenda. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'll have to stop. But it's probably open agenda. We understand what it is. It's class war, and naturally the masters, one side of the class war, fights it all the time, relentlessly. They use every opportunity. The questioner mentioned September 11th. That was a window of opportunity that allowed them to ram through harsh, regressive measures. Yeah, I'll stop. Yeah, I understand. Yeah. And they want everyone else to stop, to look somewhere else, to feel patriotic and submissive and so on. You just have to resist that. What will be the outcome of the World Trade Organization negotiations, or even whether it will exist, is in the hands of the public. And they just have to understand that and be willing to organize and act to reach their own objectives. Lots of other really interesting questions, and I'm sorry I'm not allowed to talk about them, but I got instructions that I have to stop, so thank you.